Many years ago, when I first started teaching economic development at Oakland University, I thought that perhaps I needed a way to help students to understand the differences between neoclassical economics, as the textbooks define it, and what we were going to be talking about in this particular class on third world economies. I introduced the idea that the assumptions of the neoclassical model often fail. And when the assumptions fail, we either need a new assumption or we just ask the question, what happens when the assumptions fail? Can the market produce a decent result, or does the market failure result in the government intervening to create an alternative outcome or an alternative solution? I decided that I needed something that students could wrap their minds around, and I decided to focus on 6 assumptions. I organized these 6 assumptions in a mnemonic I called the Prices mnemonic, P-R-I-C-E-S. And over the years, I've modified it to change what one of the assumptions might be based on how important I thought it was. But for the past 20 years or so, I've pretty much settled on the 6 assumptions that I thought were important and what the differences were for developing countries versus for textbook theory, which would approximate the United States economy. So textbook theory versus reality. As with any theory, we might have assumptions that are not exactly realistic. The realism of the assumption often does not seem to matter in terms of an outcome. For example, you can assume a linear model when the model is nonlinear and the qualitative outcomes are the same, even though the reality differs from the oversimplified model. And that is what a model is, an oversimplification of reality to capture the key aspects for classroom purposes. So what are these 6 assumptions I opted to focus on in what I call the Prices mnemonic? The P stands for property rights. The R stands for rational self-interest. I call rational self-interest the central tenet in neoclassical economic theory. If economics were a religion, rational self-interest would be the god that was worshipped in neoclassical economics. Rational self-interest. As a consequence, we do not want to touch the assumption of rational self-interest because you want to believe that around the world, people are rational and they act in their self-interest. Indeed, even when people appear to be acting in others' interests, one has to conclude that they get enough satisfaction from acting in others' interests that in reality they're acting in their self-interest. So altruism, for example, is a form of self-interest. If you get satisfaction from donating money to a charity or to giving time to help some poorer person, the satisfaction you get is self-interest. The rationality portion, again, that is the Holy Grail, and we assume that individuals are rational. Whatever choices they make are rationally informed. Rational comes from the word to reason, and reason means you're thinking about what you're doing, so there is a pattern of behavior based on thought. So rational decision-making is the central tenet in neoclassical economics, and I would say all economics or all human behavior. We assume that individuals are acting rationally. It may or may not always be true, but it's a good place to start. Assume, for instance, that we thought that people acted irrationally. What kind of theory could we develop based on irrationality? I would say no good theory would come out of assuming irrationality. So even if you know people are irrational, economics assumes that these individuals are behaving rationally. And then we ask questions. Does the rationality assumption lead us to explain the person's behavior appropriately? Or do we need an alternative assumption, but we don't know which one to play with? Because rationality, as I said, is the Holy Grail. What I would say is that there are different forms of rationality. So in the literature, there's conversation about what is called bounded rationality. What is bounded rationality? It is rationality based on limited information. So for instance, if you can only see today's outcomes, you might make a decision about today without thinking about tomorrow. If you can see into the future or you have expectations about the future, then the decision you make today might be different because there's a longer term horizon. Quick examples of this would be individuals in poor countries who are putting money in retirement funds. If you don't plan to be around for retirement, then there's no point in putting money away for retirement. Alternatively, if you don't view that there are many options from education, there's no point in investing in education. So we will see different people behaving differently because they view the world differently. Their time horizons are different. So that helps to understand the idea of a bounded rationality. You're either not informed enough to make a better decision, or you're informed but you do not believe that those conditions apply to you, and therefore there is no point in planning for a period when you will not be around. Yes, there's the idea of intertemporal generations. However, that might be a little more than we want to deal with at this point. So we've taken care of the P and the R, sort of. The I in my mnemonic is for information. And the current generation has grown up in a world where information is readily available, easily available, at a low cost, and almost perfect. We are much better informed nowadays than we used to be 2 generations ago. So the assumption that information is perfect means that people have the information to make better decisions, whereas 100 years ago people were not that well informed, and even if the information was available, they did not have the ability to process that information frequently, and therefore imperfect information would have been more the reality rather than perfect information. Information might still be imperfectly available, imperfectly understood, imperfectly accessible, but the assumption that information is becoming more perfectly accessible and available certainly is the reality. But that is the I in my prices mnemonic. The C is competition. Now we know that the ideal of perfect competition exists only in textbooks, and there are some markets that approach perfect competition. For example, the foreign exchange market, some commodities markets, stock markets, maybe. The idea that the market's clear, the demand and supply equilibrate, and market's clear. There are many players, many demanders, and many suppliers, so the assumptions of perfect competition hold, and therefore assuming that competition is perfect is not an unreasonable assumption. However, when there are few suppliers, we know that we're talking about what is called imperfect competition. Perfect competition assumes a large number of buyers and sellers. Clearly, a situation with a monopoly leaves us with a large number of buyers but only one seller, or duopoly, 2 sellers, or oligopoly, few sellers. So in countries where there are not many suppliers, there's not a lot of competition. We can easily see where imperfect competition will obtain. Sometimes on the demand side, there are few buyers, and the buyers may be the government and a few others. So many farmers might find that there's only one place to sell their output, and therefore that buyer has what is called monopsony power. When there are not a large number of buyers and sellers, the market that is considered to be perfectly competitive can fail, and we end up with imperfectly competitive markets. The E is efficiency. There are 2 types of efficiency discussed in economics. One is called technical efficiency, and technical efficiency is doing the best you can with the resources you have. And the other is called allocative efficiency, which is the intersection of demand and supply. Obviously, for perfect competition, we're talking about allocative efficiency, whereas for many production processes, if you have the ability to get to the production frontier, you say that you're operating in a technically efficient manner. One of the long-standing criticisms of developing countries is that they operate inside their production possibilities frontier. The rationality assumption would lead us to ask, why would you operate and produce less than your ability allows you to? So it could be information, it could be some other constraint. So we need to find different ways to discuss the lack of technical efficiency. And what I will use is a linear programming approach to show how all of the production outcomes are not possible in developing countries because the technologies or techniques are not available, and therefore you find yourself with a limited number of techniques, and therefore you're operating inside what might be a smooth PPF on some linear segment of the production possibilities frontier. The last of my 6 assumptions is sovereignty, or freedom to choose. In a democracy, in a capitalist democracy, in a Western-style democracy that is well established, individuals will cherish their right to make their own choices without interference from the governmental authorities or other agencies. It is frequently the case in many developing countries that sovereignty of choice is not available, and we end up with situations where there are excess demands or excess supplies, the prices are sticky or fixed, and therefore the efficient outcome cannot be obtained in terms of demand equals supply, and individuals end up with wanting something that they can't have access to. So excess demand might exist, and it raises questions. What if there's an excess or unmet demand? What do the individuals who do not get access do? In some cases, we will say that they go to the parallel markets or the illegal markets, and therefore they circumvent the legal system so they can have access to the things they want. I've often said that government should not make laws that turn good citizens into criminals, and sometimes we impose prices that are restrictions, either prices set too low or prices set too high, that just cause individuals to behave in ways that are self-interested but look like they're inefficient. That conversation will come up later in the semester as we discuss fixed exchange rates and ask the question, is fixing the exchange rate or the price of foreign currency below market clearing a good thing, a bad thing? What are the benefits and costs of fixing the exchange rate at a price that is not market clearing? So that conversation will bring to light the idea that sometimes it is reasonable for the authorities to intervene, take the sovereignty of choice away, because given the sovereignty of choice, not so good outcomes could be obtained, or not so equitable outcomes could be obtained. So that's the backdrop against which the course will be taught, the failure of the neoclassical assumptions, and I've focused on 6 of these. Hopefully one will understand why these 6 were chosen.